Welcome to the Collaborating for Food System Resiliency Happy Hour. I am Dawn and I am your host today. And but seriously, the good what? Oh, sorry. And what's good is when people come to the last session of the last day, they're committed people are actually in this, and this isn't going to be, we may even pivot this a bit from being informative as much as actually just really feeling like this is a community of practice where we're sharing what we're doing in our spaces, because I'm pretty excited about the talkers. I am just here moderating today, so I won't take much of your time, but Zoe did give me the challenge of first, obviously, showcasing that we're going to have 4 speakers today who the common denominator there is the systems approach they're taking to look at resiliency. I actually just had that term kind of sneak up on me. And so I just started using it like everyone else did. But when Zoe kind of challenged me about what we meant by that, I had less of a good answer for that than looking at some of the graphics that had caught my attention this year when people asked me to come give presentations about resiliency. And this is one which I think really highlights really well the fact that even if you weren't already doing systems work and multidisciplinary work, COVID and the supply chain disruptions that happened and the projects you're going to hear about today made some new linkages and bridges and connections across our communities that weren't necessarily happening to the level that they're happening now. And I thought this was a good way to kind of represent that, and at bare minimum covers everything you're going to hear about today. In a book I was fortunate enough to edit that just came out. This is something one of the community-based projects on nutrition looked at, where they talked about actually bringing stakeholder groups together and having each one of them identify priorities for what for their place in a community or world, and how they thought about food, how you actually have each of those independent communities of practice making those decisions, and then look from linkages across them, as we all are continuing to do interdisciplinary work. And where resiliency ends up showing up in that is where they were identifying the vulnerability points in their community for why people were either food insecure or not getting the nutrition they needed. And then, of course, this is something that came out of, I think this was actually an FAO report a long time ago. Again, just this idea that all of us who work in food systems, by definition, because we were already in that systems mind frame, think about resiliency just because it makes it so crystal clear how many different places the food system can go wrong and what the ripple effect might be. So more than bringing answers to you today, I think what all of these papers have in common is they do focus on short chain systems, which we know are increasingly popular, are getting increasing funding, perhaps have a lot of inferred attributes, which we still as scientists have not always nailed whether we're actually hitting the mark on those. But they also have a lot of disruption points, and they're perhaps more visible and noticeable because they are, unlike the kind of the bigger food system, never hidden. They're kind of out there in plain sight for the people in the communities they live in. So I'm excited to see these papers because they have such a nice mix of all the way from like what true business enterprises are doing to what policymakers are doing. So with that, I'm not going to take any more time. And when we come back from these 4 presentations, we have a few questions we have seated, but if you guys have more interesting questions, we'll start with those, but we have some in case we need to have discussion. But for now, let me get to the speakers so we have time for discussion. And if it's okay, I'm going to go in the order that's on the screen. So Zoe, Ariana, Kinda, and then Tim, you're going to be the grand finale. So listen in and we'll get to you. I'll mostly let these ladies introduce themselves unless they wanted to, but because they know I know stories that they don't want introduced by. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zoe.
All right, is everyone cool? I think this is picked up on the author order. Is that cool with everyone?
Oh, I thought this was your order that was in the.
No, it's not, but that's okay. That's okay.
Okay, then.
We're just, everyone's cool with that? Okay. Oh, in the app. Okay, so I'm gonna go back. So I think then Tim, you get to lead us off if you are okay with that instead of what we just said, so that we're consistent with what's in the app. I think it's that, and then. Okay, thank you.
And totally fine wherever.
Okay, so I'm gonna, I think, stop share so that you can share your screen. Hold on a sec, end slideshow. Where'd you go? I'm gonna give you. Okay, Tim, you should be able to share your screen now.
Okay. How's that? Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. And your sound is great too.
All right, perfect. Well, I will jump in with my effort to try to keep this at as close to the 10.0 minutes. Don, I appreciate this being promoted to a happy hour session. I hope that's a good sign. Miss being there with everybody. But I did want to take this occasion to introduce this project. Don and I and several others have been working on this local food systems response to COVID. It was a cooperative agreement with USDA AMS, Building Better Beyond, and something that that launched right in the very first parts of COVID in a time of real crisis, and just a few kind of backstage setting things that I think will help us transition to this crisis response to thinking about resilience, which I think that context is going to be really important for all the things we're looking to take on here. And so the Building Better Beyond project was initiated by the AMS folks thinking about how do we survive a crisis, and this whole effort to look for ways to share resources, create voice for local food, particularly to USDA, to state departments of ag, lots and lots of people scrambling around March, April, May, that 2020 time, looking for ways to get input, get voice in the middle of a lot of crazy disruption. And a lot of that effort focusing across the local food system and the many players on rapid response and impact assessments, and managing the pivot, the word we're all kind of tired of hearing about, but that was really the big focus at the time. And community after community, as we look across these different communities of practice that have various degrees of formal or informal networks of organization, were doing their own various activities to try to survive. The farm to school network folks, even some of the produce auctions along the Ohio River Valley where we're working at, everybody's scrambling and thinking about the new ways that we have to do business and trying to get a finger on the pulse of data or information or market feedback there that would give a sense of what sort of changes were taking place and how do we respond to a crisis in short-term needs. The National Farmers Market Coalition did a market manager survey in the fall there during that crisis period, and seeing lots of vendors reporting big increases in sales and lots of vendors getting really crushed, and especially those folks that were involved in some of the artisanal food products. You all remember the debates and tensions about what do we define as an essential business, and lots of very sudden new terms and concepts that we were having to think about in our food business world, and especially impacting folks in the short supply chain spaces. A lot of the efforts, as we'll get into in a little bit more, focused around particular concern for folks with limited access, and what is the role of local food systems in the sort of social contract or social responsibility to help deal with these emerging issues in what was revealed to be a fairly fragile system there at the time. And so much change introduced there. A lot of these issues of delivery and new kinds of payment systems, and every segment from the farmers market, CSA, and others were all seeing a huge surge in new data needs. And this is an important preamble to this second phase of our project. But seeing new data needs, new analytics needs, new need for timely reporting, and ultimately new management assistance to be able to integrate these kinds of things as they were trying to respond to short-term change. And so let me just put a little seed here with this slide, and maybe our future conversations, we think about resilience. I think a part of the issue here for our local and regional food systems work, and as we think about extension and roles of university and agencies, is thinking about how do we create these and support these new kinds of data and management needs that have emerged out there. It's just a few of them. So much disruption. You guys have seen some of these things, but the thing that was interesting for me is that as part of the very high velocity changes that were taking place in the food industry and the economy at the time, we found ourselves scrambling for all kinds of new types of real-time data. And so things like, suddenly we're all familiar with SafeGraph and all the new Google Analytics and the website scrubbing and all these other kinds of ways to collect new data and to document some of the changes that were taking place, and noting just with fairly dramatic impact, real-time changes that were requiring real-time responses. In pulling our coalition together in that initial phase one of the project, it involved bringing together a really diverse network of partners that were all working in this local foods space. And so a big part of that goal in that coalition was just getting these people together around a table. And it was certainly helpful to have a crisis like COVID to facilitate this. But I think as we look to these questions about resiliency, it's really now a question of how do we keep these folks at the table and continuing to look at kind of the longer term build of data sharing, communication, policy, and things like this that are going to be really critical across all this local food systems space and the institutions that are involved with it. The initial crisis feeding, as we were getting through these listening sessions, you could see people all over the place in terms of anxious, apprehensive, positive, cautiously optimistic, uncertain, exhausted was a common. There's just a lot of short-term trying to get your finger in the dike solution solving there in the short run. And I think a really pretty impressive job in bringing people together in that space through a lot of different kinds of innovations to have these regular meetings, listening sessions, collect some data, identify some innovations that were working across the local food system, have these public-facing webinars that could help facilitate some of these conversations. Don and a few others led some national consumer survey work on some of these COVID impacts, all with a view to provide better market information here for the local foods system community. We saw lots of information that was gathered out of this, and we aren't going to be able to summarize it here just in this short sort of overview space, but a couple of things that I think were really important. We're seeing the changes in the consumer response and recognizing the need to really develop systems that will help us to better understand consumer response as we think about a stronger, higher performing, resilient food system. Lots of new questions emerging around values, shopping patterns, et cetera. And on the supply side, just thinking about how farms have capacity to adapt. And one of the things that just keeps coming up again and again, and I'll be interested to hear some other feedback on this, but the gray market information that is connected with our local food systems, we're always in this beg, borrow, steal on the fringes in many times in terms of some of the standard Census of Agriculture or census surveys generally, and getting real-time information is really difficult. And surges in demand that we saw in some parts of the sector, crowbar in the spokes, in some other parts of the sector, but just really leading to disruption. But what this
In about 2 minutes.
yep, that'll work. What this brought us to then is thinking past the building better beyond frame and trying to think now about resilient local food systems. And I think still the need to create this local voice of these coalitions to entities like USDA, but really trying to build a focus in this phase 2 of this to resiliency playbooks in this market information challenge for our community. And so really, just like Don was saying, all of us kind of just diving in and trying to understand, hearing this resilience term, some good and some bad things connotations wise, but looking at community systems, looking at even ecosystems and other kinds of economic business systems where the concept of resilience was playing out, and seeing this kind of a longer term building process toward flexibility and a cohesive system that involves stakeholder investment and decentralization and diversity, the strategic action and intentionality. Just the last couple of slides to kind of show you where we stand right now. One of the authors that's done a lot of work in this resiliency area from a psychology framework talks about resilience as the ability to bounce back from adversity, frustration, and misfortune. And I think that's a good starting point in terms of how we think about the local food system. But I also have been collecting feedback from some of our different community of practice partners. And just this comment expressed here by this gal with the NAFTMA group, talking about resilience, that truly it always feels as if the topic is so large it can hardly be tamed. And I think that's a fair assessment of where I think a lot of our industry people are at right now. Let me just jump to our last things. There's lots that I think we need to understand better, and I think we're developing a roadmap for the kinds of research, the kinds of information, the kinds of ways that we engage the local food system here, but lots of volatility in the data, lots of changes taking place in our food systems is continuing, and hard to tell what sort of convergence. Big expansion in the niche meat processing, big expansion in the certified kitchen spaces, and we see it in the CSA space. And are these short-term questions? So just to kind of just give the last framing here of this second phase of this cooperative agreement that we've got with USDA, 2 focuses with this resiliency playbook. And the second objective is to create this better local regional food systems data warehouse that can be a resource, an asset to help us develop high performance local food systems. And lots of pieces to that in the resiliency playbook. What are the performance issues and measures and policies, roles of these collaborative institutions? Increasingly, I think there's going to be a role for an advisory committee or advisory community to USDA and to the National Association of State Departments of Ag. But we're seeing emerging in importance food access, diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, climate change, all these things that have just really pushed forward as additional things beyond COVID that are accelerating our needs here. And kind of behind that, or in tandem with that, the need to develop stronger data systems that allow us to get better access to real-time data, whether we're creating them ourselves, the communities of practice are creating them, USDA and NASS being innovative in terms of what data gets collected, trying to develop a roadmap there. So those are my comments, and interested then to hear what sort of response and perspectives others have and some of the projects other folks are working on here. So thanks, Don.
Thank you. And if it's okay with everyone, because this is kind of going to be treated like a panel at the end, we're going to leave questions to the end where Tim can weigh in. Oh yeah, of course. Okay, so he quit sharing his slides. So now you know where yours is on here? Okay. So next we'll be hearing from Zoya Puckett on the Ohio Food Systems Emergency Management Response during COVID.
I'm glad you were timing. I was like, wait, we didn't talk about who's going to do that. Okay, cool. Hold on a sec. Yeah, I just have to open my slides here. We got this. All righty, awesome. Can you hear me okay there, Tim? Awesome. And others, if there are other folks on there. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that I engaged with Shoshana Inwood, who's a rural sociologist, Jill Clark, who's in food policy and policy school, Nicole Wright, who's an extension at Ohio State, and Aiden Irish, who is currently a postdoc, as well as Josh Vitti, who is an Ohio State graduate, which is how this connection initially was made in this project, a graduate from the policy school, who's currently with the Ohio Emergency Management Agency. So how it began. So the Ohio Emergency Management Agency is essentially the state equivalent of FEMA. And each state has their own emergency management agency. And so Josh reached out to Jill, who was his professor, and said, hey, I know you know about food systems. So we're in emergency management. This isn't something normally we deal with, but this is now, of course, this was like early 2020, right? This is now something we're dealing with and we're out of our depths. Can you help? Right. And started this conversation. So first of all, yay, they called the academics. That doesn't happen. Right. So that's cool. And so we started having a conversation, and Jill brought in me and Shoshana and said, hey, let's talk about this. Let's work on this. So the Ohio EMA mission is to coordinate activities to mitigate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. They don't have experience with food systems and food supply chains. The normal way that they're thinking about responding in terms of food is related to mass care. So emergency feeding, if there's like a natural disaster, ensuring that people have meals immediately, right, in the case of some kind of disaster. And so these disruptions are really new. And so we built an interdisciplinary team. I already mentioned these different folks to help address this gap in state emergency management. And it's an ongoing partnership to try to think about and understand what is the role of state emergency management and emergency management at other levels in the context of food systems and food supply chains. So our project goals were to help position Ohio emergency management to respond to similar future emergencies, right? We know this is not the only situation. We have, of course, an ongoing emergency of COVID, right, as it continues to affect our food supply chains. But also we know that there are future disasters and disruptions that could be long-term and systemic in nature, and we need to be prepared for them, and we can learn from this situation. We also want to understand the role of Ohio state government agencies and nonprofits involved with food system related programs and policies, right, to help Ohio EMA respond to these. And we want to map how food related policies and programs interact with these state level agencies and organizations and try to visualize their relationships. And we know that a lot of our states experienced either there were federal policies that were emergency policies that came into place, and state policies that came into place. And those policies were all creating these new paths of administrative authority, of funding, et cetera, in our states. And so we wanted to really visualize that and understand that a little bit. So We started just with the conversation. We later got some seed funding from the Ohio State Initiative for Food and Agricultural Transformation. And this is something that we hope to continue to pursue to really start bringing together the conversation of people who know food systems and food supply chains and people who know emergency management to try to make that a more cohesive conversation. So our methods were we reviewed Ohio Emergency Management Agency emergency support function plans. So there are 3 of these ESFs that relate to the food system. One is mass care. So this is really just about making sure that people have their immediate food needs met in the case of a disaster disruption. Resource support and logistics, right? So this has to do with transportation and infrastructure. And then there's a food and agriculture, which has more to do with the processing and production side of things. So we began with video interviews with state agency contacts related to food and agriculture. We interviewed folks, so based on the recommendations of Ohio Emergency Management, we started interviewing folks who are program contacts for food policies and programs that were intersecting with emergency management. And we asked them about their programs, about their roles and key challenges for these programs, the impacts of COVID on these policies and programs to understand what those specific shifts were that were happening, waivers and extra things here and there. And then we also asked about the key public and private partners involved in policy and program implementation. So using a policy field mapping approach developed by Sanford and Moulton for visualizing administrative, financial, and political relationships, we use this approach to develop a policy field map. So we do this. I'll show you the big field map in a second. We also have these smaller field maps, right? So we developed a couple of outputs so far. One is a state food policy and program database with program contacts. Surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, there's a lot of people in different agencies related to food that don't know each other within the state. And there's a lot of people that don't even think about themselves as doing food things. For example, folks in corrections, right? Of course, they are feeding large amounts of people, right? And so, but they don't, you say, hey, we want to talk to you about food, or you call the Department of Transportation, hey, we want to talk to you about food. All of our food is transported around the state. They don't think of themselves being involved in food, right? And so there's ways that even the people who are touching food don't really see themselves as such key players in the food supply chain. So we did this database, policy field maps. So we have smaller ones for certain policies. And we also have a report and summary to share with agencies and food system actors. And I'll give you a link to our report at the end if you want to check it out. Okay, so this is the little one. You can see we got we did a fancy one. So the different colors, right, signify different types of flows. So there's political influence, administrative authority, funding, program administration, product supply, so in-kind things. And so we tried to this policy field mapping, right? We have national level, state level, and local level. So we were trying to link everything up through all these different agencies. Of course, every state, these relationships look different, right? Sometimes funding for certain federal programs goes through a different agency. So this is just Ohio. But here's the big map. I know you can't see anything. That's kind of the point. This you can blow it, like you can go on the website and you can zoom in. But basically, this is every the federal levels on the top, the state levels in the middle, the local levels at the bottom. We tried to get everything that touches food and ag in the state. So these are all different federal agencies. These are all different state agencies. The green and yellow lines represent emergency management agencies' connections in this. So they don't have tons of resources, but their role is to basically make connections that need to be made in an emergency to help people do the things that they need to do. And so the food and ag group, all the green lines are all connections where the people who run that food and ag group are connected on all of these green dotted lines. The yellow lines are mass care. So this is that like immediate feeding and basic need. And so Josh, who's working with us, is in the mass care unit. We've heard some amazing stories of him, of all the connections of things that he was doing kind of to make things work. So, okay. Key takeaways from this work. COVID was fundamentally a different type of emergencies from previous recent emergencies. And the way I like to say it in every interview I do is every point in the food supply chain that has humans in it is affected by COVID. That's every point in the supply chain. And so this is also, as Josh mentioned when I shared these slides with him, he's like, really what EMA does is we are about mutual aid. That is the core of how we work. And he's like, when every part of our system is affected, it is difficult for one part to support the other part. We kind of rely in this model on somebody being in a good space to be able to provide something for somebody else. And when when there's a systemic pressure, it's really difficult for that model to operate. So it's not the only possible emergency with the potential to impact the entire food system. We really need robust and coordinated food supply chain and system level responses in Ohio emergency food provision and planning. You know, there was actually this amazing paper, probably y'all have read it by now, about how pandemic could affect food supply chains. It was published like a couple years before COVID. Hit the nail on the head for everything. Like these are things that we can think about and understand. And then there's the fog of response was the big thing, right? There's some really complex relationships here. And so we need to really understand them. These are the recommendations that came out of our report. EMA, emergency management personnel, one of their language things, they do this thing called tabletop exercises. They do a lot of scenarios, right, to plan for, you know, we recently participated in a scenario. Well, what if there was a nuclear incident at a nuclear plant in Ohio? It's really interesting to talk through that with people from all different parts, like folks in the state, to think about what are the ways that could affect people, and what are the ways that could particularly, Shoshana and I both participated, affect food and agriculture. So short term, we can start to incorporate, we can start to help build case studies and tabletop exercises for emergency management personnel, and the network build to help EMA get connected to people in the state on food systems. Medium term, we can convene state level administrators of these policies and programs so that those relationships are built when we're not in crisis and can be leveraged when we are in crisis. And long term, you know, this speaks to a need to diversify Ohio's agriculture environment and really reflect on the role of emergency management in system wide emergencies. And then if you want to look at the report, you can use this QR code and it links to our report and our website, where you can see that and you can see more of those field maps in the database. So thank you. I'm gonna let you pull it up. I don't know which one it is.
Okay. So I'm going to be moving to more of a okay, here we go. Specific. Yeah, I'll do that. Hold on. Sorry, I'm a Mac person, so this is okay. Okay. Yeah, here we go. Okay, awesome. So I'm Kinder Curtis. I'm sorry, my voice is trashed, but anyway, welcome to the third presentation in today's happy hour. If you need a drink refill, feel free to come up and get what you need. Be fine. I'm going to be talking about some maybe models is not the correct word, but really what leads to higher resiliency within the food and drink tourism industry. So that's going to be talking a little bit, some research that I'm doing, or I should say I'm not the only one, but to that. So these are things I'm going to go over with related to that. So I guess it was spring of 2021, a tourism professor who's a friend of mine, Susan Slocum, and I
We did interviewed about 6 or 7 wineries in California, rural wineries, to look at tourism, resiliency factors. So what was it about their operation that made them more resilient, or made them able to better cope with COVID? What's the word that Tim doesn't like? Pivot. That's right. Pivot and survive on. So we actually published those results. I presented them at the FDRS meeting last fall, and we published those results in a special issue on tourism and sustainability. I know it's that journal that's kind of unhinged at this point, but anyway, it's there. It's six people. So the study I'm talking about today really builds on that, but we're going to be using survey data in the drink tourism industry. So breweries, wineries, distilleries. We're kind of doing this in an effort to make some serious headway to apply for a large grant funded project. There was been some mention about what resiliency is, but in the business econ literature, it's a firm or enterprise resilience is defined as the capacity for an enterprise to survive, adapt, and grow in the face of an unexpected or turbulent change, economic shock, social change, that kind of thing. And so the resilient can be the ability of an operation to go back to its original state, assuming that original state was a profitable one, or to actually a new improved state. I don't know if you guys remember probably like second year graduate school econ, when we looked at how people would diverge off a system and then come back, that type of thing. So that's what it follows there. And therefore prevent going out of business, avoiding a failure, that type of thing. So the resiliency literature within the ag space is very minimal. I have to say it has grown a lot since I started working on this more than a year ago. So there's more and more there, but most of it was originally within the small business literature. Kind of some of the main aspects that we see, the factors. I've listed them here as part of the lit review in that paper, but basically a lean short management span. And this is why small businesses and family businesses tend to be able to survive well. Rapid decision making, have a culture of learning, focus on core competencies. They really know how to do what they do well. And they also are very customer centered. They have the ability to be creative and flexible, and they have solid social networks and work, also with a lot of other businesses in their area and that type of thing. So that's kind of what we know. So we are currently running a Qualtrics survey where we have invited 3,200 wineries and 1,750 breweries and distilleries in 8 Western states have invited to take the survey. We have asked them a plethora of questions, as you can see, 42, but they're able to finish the survey in less than 10 minutes. So it's not overwhelming. But we have asked them a lot of different business details about their structure, ownership, labor agreements, their production, how big their vineyards are, whether they buy their grapes, or it goes on and on. Anyway, of course, their product offerings, marketing methods, what type of agritourism or types of activities they do within the winery, if any. The networks they have, all that kind of thing. And then finally, what kind of happened with their situation in COVID and from a number of perspectives. So as of this morning, we have 53 brewery distillery responses and 34 wineries. So I'm pretty happy. Again, my goal with this is to take this to dive into a bigger project later. So I just wanted to give you guys just a few things. We'll start with the breweries. Because you can see here, most of them, their primary thing is a tasting or tap room, followed by they also do tours. Live music is also popular, so they are definitely in the drink tourism space. They do offer these things quite often. So this is really the kicker question right here, and then probably will end up being, the dependent variable at some point. But anyway, is what percentage of revenue did you see that losses that you saw that results of the pandemic 2020? We also have a secondary question in 2021, so we can kind of look at the impacts between the 2 years. You can see with the breweries, it was quite high. As you see that the 26% to 50% category was quite high, as well as the 51 to 75% category. So this is actually a lot higher than I had imagined based upon the interviews that we did. But we had just interviewed wineries, so not breweries. Visitor experiences were shut down primarily less than 5 months. So 2 months or less is at the bottom. So that's good. They weren't necessarily out less than 6 months generally. What were their primary challenges? There's a lot here on this slide. I don't know how well you can read it. But the primary ones were closures and social distancing, decreased visitors, those types of things. And then, but most of them had pretty high hit on there. So a lack of, especially supplies, that one came in. What adjustments were made, as you can see with these responding breweries, adding delivery pickup options and creating outdoor tasting options were the two primary, but also decreasing their operation hours, including outdoor dining as well as tasting, were also quite high, decreasing their labor. So, and then as you can see, we tested this survey and we had input, but I have a lot of other on most of these because I want to be informed when we do the full rollout. So if you want to know what all the other was, because on a couple of them, I'll show you the others, like, half the respondents had an other. I'm happy to send that to you if you have an interest. So that was breweries, and that's kind of looking at basically, the COVID challenges. So I'm not presenting the overview of all 42 questions. I don't think you guys want to see that, and I don't have time, but anyway. So for wineries, they primarily offer tasting room experiences, but also vineyard tours and other events. It looks like came in, as well as like live music are their primary tours and activities. They had a much less, how do I put this? Their revenues losses were much less than the brewery. So we're seeing mostly, they said none, or certainly less than 25%. So again, these two industries, I consider them to be similar industries, but they're actually very different, and they had different impacts. So shut down, again, most of them in the wineries were shut down less than 6 months. And we're pulling from 8 states who had different laws and things that went on, as you guys know. So just their biggest, again, same here, closures were their biggest challenges, as well as decreased visitors and social distancing. They also went to outdoor tasting, added delivery, and I don't see it here. I'm not sure it's not here, but we also, a lot of them, of course, went to more e-commerce online. Well, that's in the marketing question. That's right. That's what that is. So anyway, so we hope to complete this kind of basic data collection this month. Or shortly. The survey's been out about 3 weeks. I'm not expecting a much more response at this point. So we're going to take all the responses we got, and we're going to be looking at how the, their business types, ownership structures, labor force, products, all this list here is going to impact kind of what happened with their revenues, or at least their stated revenues from 2020-21. So we'll be doing some modeling, and then probably also doing some cluster analysis, kind of get an idea of what these businesses that were more successful, or were able to be more successful during the time, actually look like. So, and then making USDA grant application in September. So that's an overview there. I'm happy to talk about this more. Yeah, I have some, if you would like wine. Dawn provided the wine, no, not me. I just want to put it out there. Yeah, there's wine and what's the drink? Gin and tonic, white and red. And I actually have if you don't like alcohol or don't want alcohol, I've actually got salad San Pellegrino here that I'll put up there in a minute. So anyway, thank you for your time. And I guess we're not doing questions because we're going to let Ariana come up and talk before we do that.
I'm also a math person, but I'll try.
Yeah, it's not too bad. Just think you put your hand in and you push.
Use all the fingers. I think this is mine. Okay, so we're gonna share again. Oh, yeah, I see the fingers. Okay, share screen. Here we go. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being here. I'm gonna try to move a little bit because I feel like I don't see anyone if I am behind the computer. But what I'm gonna talk about is actually kind of like a case study. It's part of a project that happened at Purdue. And it was right when COVID hit. So March 2020, I got an email saying, we're gonna launch an initiative with Microsoft and we're gonna help smaller farmers sell their produce. And that was it. So the rest you're gonna see here. I don't need to talk about how COVID changed because a lot of people have said a lot about it, but we're gonna focus on online sales. And we know that a lot of farmers try to sell produce online because they couldn't go to the farmer's market. Maybe the farmer's market closed, maybe the restaurant closed, which is even more dramatic. But so they were trying to use Facebook, Instagram, Craigslist. Their farmers market, sometimes they had, and this is Indiana, right? Sometimes they had a website for selling. So there's a lot of things that happen. We all know what happened, but then online sales of groceries just started climbing very fast. And we know that that was across the country. So there was, at the same time that we decided to do that, there was a lot of farmers across the US. We try to compile all the projects that were trying to link farmers to consumers. And this was direct marketing through online. And there's a lot of interest. Farmers were having different sales models. So we were trying to say, okay, what are they all doing pre-COVID? And how can we help post-COVID? Because we didn't know what was going to happen, how long it was going to be. So we kind of looked into, there were virtual farmers markets, there were buying clubs, there were down, like it was a plethora of a lot of options. So we decided to create Hoosier Food Market. So Hoosier Food Market was an initiative with the Purdue College of Ag and Microsoft. I think we had a couple of different initiatives, but this was one that I was heavily involved. And I need to credit my colleague, Amanda Deering in food science, who was leading it on the managing everyone. And then we had two people from the College of Ag that are doing data analytics, Aaron Walls and Nathan Bacon. And basically just coming up with a name, it was a hassle because it was another company called Hoosier Farm Market that was for profit. So they wanted to know why did we choose Hoosier Food Market and what were the implications about it. So what we did was basically use an open network. So we grabbed, we didn't have a lot of time. So what do we do fast? And the people from Microsoft were in charge of building the platform, and we were in charge of building the farmers or bringing the farmers to the platform. So we basically got that open source code, I guess, and then we built that to tailor it to Indiana and to small farmers in Indiana. And that was a software that ideally would have made easier growers to put whatever they have, like a virtual store, and then consumers get and purchase. And then also farmers markets could connect to each other. I'll show you how it was designed. There were reports, farmers could get reports as often as every day. Ideally, it was the whole idea of a transparent supply chain, easy payment, because there was payment online, and then people can shop by filter and filter products. And this is what the website looked like. We try to pick up a photo of what would it look like a farm in Indiana, and that's a barn. And I'm aware that a lot of specialty crop farmers may not have a barn. So that was interesting as well. But one of the things that I wanted to show is this logo. It's actually the open source code that we grabbed, because it's I'm going to show you later on how this all happens. And what would happen is, so this is the user, and then the farmer or farmers market could have, or food hub, because that was also available for food hubs, could have gone and say shopping, and there was a cart, your typical website. But you can also go to different shops where you can map in Indiana who is logged in. what are the producers do a lot, and then everybody can buy and sell things ideally. And how was the idea of Hoosier Food Market? So the Open Food Network was the open source code that we use. And the idea is farmers could have just put everything online and not selling. So it's like a virtual display of what you have. Like if you have a website and you don't want to engage in e-commerce, you could have just have a profile. But if you want to sell products, and this is a lot of things that we grabbed from Open Food Network, you could have sold them, you could have a shop, and you could have set your farmer's market or any food hub to sell for you. Because the idea is that you can say, I'm linked to West Lafayette Farmers Market, and West Lafayette Farmers Market is going to sell my produce or whatever I have. So it was an idea, it was very interactive. So that was the best open source code that we could find that would adapt to smaller farmers, because there's a bunch of products that may be different or whatnot. And this is what a single producer online shop would look like. And I tend to shop online a lot. I don't know if you do, but I do. And I have a lot of thoughts about how it looks like. Ideally it would have been looking nicer or whatnot, but that was an open source network. And so you can see this is actually a farm in Indiana. They had different soups, and then they would put the price here. And then the people would have said the quantity, and it goes to the cart, and then people buy. And then they will choose, the farmer would decide, okay, how am I going to deliver it? Are they going to come to my farm? Are they going to come to the farmer's market? A lot of farmers were selling at the farmer's, just delivering and a curb pickup. Anything that would have been ideally. And then farmers, what they would use is, this is like a demo that I did, and I did a lot of videos about how do you create this, because I think we all know that some of the farmers may not know how to do this online. So there is a lot of background, and how do we build these videos that are going to help farmers do this easily? Lots of webinars and a lot of meetings. We had weeks, every week a meeting for 2 years. So it was a lot of things happening. But basically a producer, you would choose, you could be many producers, matter of fact. You could have many users, and then you say, what's the product? You decide the units, the price, and then if you have how many you have, so you could get reports on inventory and see how inventory turnover goes. And then you would choose a lot of things, which made things a little bit complicated to actually train growers. And then we did a lot of training in terms of, okay, growers didn't know how to sell. I mean, March, April, May, we got a lot of calls. It's like, I don't know how to sell things. So a lot of it, okay, what are your markets and how are they delivering currently? And can you be part of it? Because we didn't think Hoosier Food Market was going to be the market, but rather a complement to whatever market sells or market channel that we have. And then we also try to talk about what was the product diversity and how was that going to accommodate with one, selling online, and two, delivering safely. We also talked a lot about growers to have weekly communication with farmers, with consumers. I know that a lot of growers created their Facebook pages because they know that Facebook was the best way. Also, how to get payments on credit card. That was a whole story behind that. But there was a lot of farmers who did cash at delivery. So people would come to the farmers market or their farm, and they would deliver it in bags and then pick up the money. It wasn't perfect, but that's what we had. In summary, this is a map of, if you don't know Indiana, this is Indiana, and this is where we were. So that's West Lafayette. It just tells us the counties that farmers who were selling, I'm saying selling farmers, maybe agribusinesses, that were selling products, and majority of them were around us. But then we have some of them in more southern, and then we have some farmers, some users in Illinois, because a lot of people were asking, can we cross a border? Can somebody in Illinois use it? Can somebody in other state can use it? So 124 users registered, and there were 268 orders, not a lot. Not a lot of orders, and a cumulative of $10,000 in sales. And that's where I'm going to lead to my next slide, because there's a lot of work behind it. So I do have some statistics, which I actually really liked. It's, so you can see the users registration. So when people were buyers were registering, and then not that long ago, like probably 2 months, May, June, July. So like a month and a half ago, we start seeing sales. So that, I like this part because we can see that when someone started, I'm not saying this is the same person, but there's a lack of adoption from consumers to say, hey, I put my product here, and then consumers a month and a half were starting to buy. So it was a month and a half, and I'm guessing people were eating every day. So something to think about is like, this is gonna take a while, and it could have taken a lot of time for us, but things picked up in, what is it, August? So there were weekly orders that we've seen traffic. And it's just like the orders, of course, most of the orders were 1 or 2, and then how the cumulative valid orders increased primarily in August. So in August is when we saw this pick up. I have, how do we do this? Okay. There were a lot of complementary efforts. So we partnered with Indiana Grown, which is our state private label. The Indiana State Department of Agriculture. There was a bunch of webinars that was with the Women in Agriculture and Small Farmers Association, you name it. And then we actually paid for a radio to promote Hoosier Food Market, so consumers could go, because we thought, okay, if consumers go to the website, farmers are going to go and this is going to work. We had news releases. I put some money from my startup package to pay to NPR in Indiana to get that, which is, it was before August. So I think it helped actually. So a few take home messages. Sustainability plan. I think any resilience, I think we talked about resilience and the sustainability long term. I think there has to be a sustainability plan, and I don't think we were ready to embark on this effort. I think sustainability plan, and what we wanted to is to Indiana Grown to take over and continue that, because it's a state label or a state proud label. So what we ideally wanted is somebody from Indiana to take over and engage on that, because we don't have the capacity as a land grant to support for profit things. The open network was not open, so we ran into trouble because when they saw that we actually had many phone calls with them, because when they saw that we were using their code, they wanted to charge us for using their code, which was completely against what open network should look like. So we had a lot of back and forth about how are we going to do it? How do we migrate growers that were already selling, because we finished in 2021. So we were working on this for a year and a half. So by late 2021, how do we migrate growers? And the idea is migrate the interface, give it to Indiana Grown, and then the growers, and then Open Food Network wanted to charge us. It was a very interesting ordeal that we had. Finding a name for a website, it's very hard, because a lot of people would have to say a lot of things about how it should be named. It was kind of tricky to support these for-profit projects because what the mission of the land grant should be. And there has to be, if we're going to promote, I think, any resilience, and I think online sales is going to stay around, we should look into how do we train farmers to do this. It's not easy for them. It's something else that they have to learn, and the learning curve, it's steep at the beginning. We know that younger farmers were easier to embark on this. I don't have the demographics of the farmers selling here, but we know that they were younger, and they were more likely to use a website. And this is really funny, because I teach a class in entrepreneurship, and my students, I want to sell online and I'm going to have a website. But this is what I tell them: just because you have a website doesn't mean people are going to use it. It was harder than expected. There has to be a lot of training, marketing, and keeping it running. The capacity that we needed to keep these for a longer time, it was going to be very hard. So that's what we wanted to. And not everyone was excited. We had some pushback from Hoosier Farm Market, actually. So that's all I got. It was a very nice experience. It was a case study that we kind of did, but there's a lot of lessons to learn from that.
Actually, one of the things you actually presented, come up and we'll do it kind of as a panel. And I have questions, but I'd rather start with if the audience wants to ask questions, and I'll just go to my questions if there aren't any from the audience, but. Yeah, Tim is here too. I'm putting him up. But Tim, you're being represented at the panel table by a brown paper bag. So,
Wow. I don't know
oh
what
no,
to
now
think
you're
about that.
a water bottle that's empty. So not to be too silly, but so are there any questions from the audience to any of these panelists? Maria?
If you plan and then nothing, well, I didn't pay, because why did I plan so much? Right, but you went through a big plan, so I mean, and so there's costs to like getting systems to be resilient, so have you thought about how to incorporate this into the project?
So as you write up fact sheets or are you refine surveys, have any of you thought about how to capture that?
So I think one of the main aspects of my project is to get with people information on how they can think about what they're doing, so that they in scientists and get someone out of the armor. What are the components of a structure that will lend themselves to so in that sense, if it's used correctly and not about it, can become quite unique, in my opinion. How much will people adopt it and pay attention? I don't know. I mean, that kind of depends on how well we explain the research and how well we look at that. That's always interesting. But yeah, anyway.
And Tim, when people are speaking from the audience, are you hearing them or do I need
I
to?
can't really hear it all. I'm sorry. You'll have
So-
to
so-
repeat it back.
So Maria kind of asked like, so one of the challenges of a planning paradigm is you can spend a lot of time planning, and if the counterfactual happens and there isn't an event, people use it as a rationale for like this, we don't need to have this much elaborate planning. So then I kind of said to you panelists, so is there any place within your projects that you're making fact sheets or refining or making policy recommendations or refining surveys to try to capture if people's perceptions about needs for plans have changed because of this being such a significant event? And Ken has already answered, but if any of the other three of you want to, Zoe?
Is all that, right? So it's already like that's, they're probably not as resistant to planning as others. But there's still is a challenge. One of the things that we're interested in is actually counties have their own kind of planning apparatus and not very broadly across counties what that looks like. And then oftentimes the person who's responsible for the plan is like part-time. I mean, they're not people with like a lot of resources and capacity like dedicated to allow them to actually do that at the county level. And then there's also, at least in Ohio, a connection to extension. So extension can actually be actively during an emergency to partner with the planning folks in the county. And so I think at the state level for the emergency management, I feel like there's a planning culture, but in some of these local county and local areas, I think that there's a lot of work to do, and that's where some of our focus will be, is like engaging on the local level to kind of help people understand how they can plan and prepare. And I think there's already an apparatus there to do it, but it can be much more robust. And hopefully this crisis has highlighted to people that would be nice to have. But I don't know if that has. We'll see.
For our project, we didn't plan it. We were the example of not planning. We were responding to a shock and the best way that could. And I think what I like about our project is that we try to do as interdisciplinary as possible, but we also try to expand, and talking about resilience, expand the connections of farmers, extension educators, extension specialists to try to to try to build those connections, because we know that resilience is going to be better when you have connections and you have networks that you can rely resources from. So I think in some way, from a non-planned project, we formed connections between at the county level, at the farm level, to how to respond to a shock in the future. And I will leave with that and go to bed with that.
Tom, do you have anything to add? I moved the mic so you could hear the other three ladies, so you guys can move that.
Yeah, Dawn, I guess I would just maybe finally add communities of practices that they recognize, for the most part, these are very complex systems. They're complex networks by themselves, the individual communities of practice that these folks are trying to develop. Most of them are trying to develop strategic plans themselves for the Farmers Market Coalition, for the National Agritourism Group, for the Food Corridor, CSA people, et cetera. I think what we saw with the COVID disruption was a high sense of urgency that accelerated bringing people together around the table. But I think also what we're continuing to see is that the local food system is really in a constant state of crisis and need. And I think people are recognizing those needs, whether it's now responding to things like the weather disruptions like we're experiencing here in Kentucky right now, or the food access questions, or the diversity issues and fairness questions. And those things, I think once we've given a platform for convening, then I think a lot of that planning and kind of priority setting happens somewhat organically. I'd be interested in your thought on that. You've seen it as well, Dawn, but I think it's creating that institutional mechanism for back and forth communication with the communities of practice and also with the state and federal agencies that are looking to try to partner in a credible way.
Yeah, so I'm not near Mike, but I'll use my big voice. But the two things I know is, well, how many of us have extension appointments? Did you all know the Eden Network before this event? I mean, that was not, I'd heard of it lightly, but mostly thinking of forest fires. But there's an Eden Network that NIFA funds, that is county-based, that's supposed to have emergency management plans, which we in Extension are all supposed to be embedded in, including our county offices, which finally has gotten the attention apparently they've been trying to get forever, because apparently those were always there. But if you look, there are light if no food action plans in that. It is more for what they thought were going to be the big things like floods, forest fires, and so forth. So there's an interest in that group to have food embedded more, kind of like they'd probably be interested in seeing what you guys formulated for Ohio, for instance. The second thing is we have our first Economic Development Administration grant, and as you know, a bunch of money flew out of DC. Well, that's one of the bigger buckets of money. We're actually going around and redeveloping state of Colorado's economic development priorities this year, because two regions chose not to do one. Well, they made some decision at EDA that you could not qualify for COVID relief funds if you didn't have priorities, because how would they assign whether the money they were giving to you addressed the priority? So the only reason I know this is because we're helping redo that plan. There is talk of, if you want to be eligible for it, I think it's the Tim. Sorry if I offended you, Tim.
His camera moved.
No, he's not.
He's on. But there's talk of next go round, whatever the event is, there being policy levers that if you don't have a plan and a set of priorities and an action plan like what Ohio just showed us, that you will not be eligible for those things. Like I was surprised no one talked about whether they asked about PPP usage. That was one thing I was like, welcome back, Tim.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no, we were sorry, but that was the one lever I felt like the feds are thinking of using, is if you do not have either something like what Ohio just showed us, or a sector can have it, like California YG can have it, that you will not be eligible because it will show you do not pre-think an ability to be resilient. And so I think the feds now are thinking about, well, we just let a lot of money flow because everyone was flat-footed. Now no one should say they didn't realize they shouldn't be flat-footed. So I think you actually might see some policy levels coming out of DC, where they say if you don't have this plan in place, or think of either as a community or an industry sector, where your resiliency strengthening has happened, you will not be eligible for recovery funds. And that, in Colorado, that's a big enough lever that the two regions that held up, we don't want to do it, all of a sudden are rolling down plans. So, guessing, I mean, you're talking millions of dollars.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but what's interesting is you're not gonna have every single farm have it. So then it's what it becomes the State Farm Bureau, the State Farm of Ag, state wine industry. I don't know what level, and maybe Ohio has an interest on it. Me and Tim are clearly in the market channel space. Is it enough for the Farmers Market Association to have a set of priorities? But then anyone who's a farmers market member would be eligible for those. For you, it would be state-based. For Kinda, it would be an industry sector-based. So that would be interesting, and for you, it would be Microsoft. I'm not worried about them. So
Me
you know,
neither.
where are the right silos to actually have the plans? And it sounds like Zoe was the closest to having that systematically thought out, but that was just a Vivian graph, so it just overwhelmed me a bit.
Oh, yeah. And that's, I mean, that's kind of the point. It's a totally dizzying graph, and then we have to think about all of that, and should it be, right? And how do we operate within that space? So.
Did anyone hear experiences from the panel that were similar to activities you got pulled into in your community or state, or?
Sorry, I don't know from extensions.
Or did you get pulled into it? Why was this some resiliency something you?
Mainly for me, like I was, especially during COVID, I was in my home. And we basically didn't have a system, so it was like everyone's like up to themselves to figure out like what's going on. So yeah, ours was like a bit different.
The international connection.
Yeah, farmers had their like produce dumped by the police. And there were instances of that in the media, and people not getting food. How did we go in the main city was there were several interest groups that were feeding daily wage workers, those who couldn't afford it because their livelihoods were lost. So there were like some people coming together, some groups coming together, especially when the regulations lapsed. But before that, like government all of a sudden decided, well, we're going to close everything. We're just going to open it for 2 hours. So you are all by yourselves. Different experience.
I think COVID, I mean, built resilience in a bad way. It was a shock that built resilience. And I think it built connections, and it built networks, and it built capital, like especially social capital. But I think and I hope that institutions, farmers, retailers, whoever is now thinking more about planning, like what Maria was saying. How do you avoid these shocks? Or how do you have a planning in point that you would avoid the impact of that shock? Because you cannot avoid that shock, but how do you avoid the impact of it or lessen the impact of it? And I think it has brought an importance to the food systems. I don't think it was part of the agenda before, and I think it's more important, but I also think there is a lot for extension people to help institutions, farmers, to think about planning and having contingency plans to avoid larger impacts, because we're just seeing disaster coming back more often. So how do we support that? Because we cannot be like us in reactive mode. We should be proactively thinking about how do we support the systems.
So, I did some work in Latin America. It's very similar to you. And we did some second sort. Second, we just thought.
Okay.
So, but what is, if you think about supply chain, so, somebody in Latin America, they were trying to go online too, and, people were selling using WhatsApp.
Mhm.
But you see, if you think about the US, they didn't have an Ariana trying to do that. But even with that, you see that they didn't have extension people teaching them
Yeah.
to do things
Sorry.
online. So, that's kind of like a big difference.
Mhm.
And, yeah, but still, the good thing is farmers were trying to adapt.
Yeah.
And a lot of people started to sell, directly. Again, using WhatsApp. Yeah, but I think again, sometimes we forget, the fact that we're extension people thinking about that. like,
We should.
extension farmers, And you have
Yeah.
online seminars, webinars, teaching them to do that.
And then how, development and
Yeah.
start different.
Well, I know the COVID pandemic for the farmers I work with, it actually got them to finally do things they've been putting off for like an online presence per se, of some kind so they needed to diversify, especially those that were strictly depending on farmers markets. Up until May, we didn't know if we were gonna have farmers markets and what would they look like.
Yeah.
And luckily our Department of Ag was very proactive in working with the farmers markets to get protocols put in place. And so out of 38, we had 30 open that summer. So yeah, I totally agree with that. And so, and I was writing blogs and doing webinar, you name it, to just talk about their options and all the vehicles that they could go to use an online platform or to join the CSA or, anyway. So we were reactive, but I think we learned a lot too, and how to
But
jump quickly.
You're part of the system, of the supply system in the US.
The extension is, yeah. Well, we do, as academics, we get to choose what we do. So there's that too. Each state has different levels of help, right?
Tim, while you were gone, there was some questions from the audience about how this looks different for developing countries, because we even have this kind of disarray, and we have one of the more formal technical systems, support systems in the world. So a couple people shared experiences where then you take out extension and what could be a rapid response infrastructure, and it didn't go so well.
Just to add like one point which I remember, this is regarding tourism in Nepal. So we announced 2020 as like a visit to Nepal year. So it was a big thing for tourism, and lots of investments, lots of hotels got involved, lots of people got involved. And starting 2020, I think they suffered a lot, those businesses. I don't remember the stats, but it was pretty bad. And even when you ask people how long it's gonna take to recover, they're at least 5 years. The tourism sector would be down for the next 5 years for sure. So that's one thing which I suddenly remember. So just sharing that with you.
Thank you.
So I have a question for everybody, because in this conversation, you're talking about producers and you're talking about consumers. And maybe in your graduate, you could not see, you have.
I know, you had their QR code.
Yeah, I know,
You
that was
can-
the point.
You
okay?
can go, yeah, exactly, that's the point.
So you
You can zoom in.
Supermarkets and retailers, so what, people were going to, everybody's going to supermarkets. There were any efforts of those guys trying to buy more locally?
Oh, yeah,
They were sourcing more locally.
definitely, definitely.
What was that reaction? Because we don't hear much about that. So that's a question for everybody.
Well, so in the project Tim and I were on, we didn't get the big guys, but we had the National Roasters Association, which is all the independents besides the 4 big. And that was their response, is that, well, they obviously, they were more poised to be online. Some of the smaller weren't. And like Kinda said, this was finally the impetus for some of them to get an online presence and have curbside and online,
Yeah.
and they did it fast. And then second, some of them, I think the reason they took the invitation is they were looking for that, but we again were flat footed because we really don't have wholesale volumes built in most of these hubs in most parts. of the country, but the hubs that were well positioned really took advantage of it, like Common Market grew phenomenally.
Mhm.
But you even saw the baby independents grow. So when, in the survey we did, like those ones that aren't 100,000 square foot footprints or the 1,500 and 2,000 square foot footprints in rural areas actually benefited from this event.
Yeah.
Probably both because they kept the local supply chain
Mhm.
valid, and then they looked like a less scary format. So I did use the long, progressive growth strat is actually a really good set of webinars. Half of them free, so I just started listening in over the last 18 months, so I didn't feel so unaware, because some of them overlap with national grocers. It was really interesting to hear the perspectives across this. And they won kind of because so many dollars came pouring to them.
Yeah.
But they were barely ahead. They know they were barely ahead, and now they're trying to figure out how to keep some of the customers, because the restaurants are fully back. We're back to the full amount of money that we spend in restaurants. They're trying to keep whatever share of what they grabbed as possible, but they haven't figured it all out either. But we saw some, did you guys see better supply chain procurement coming out of those guys? Except for, we didn't see much of the big four, but besides them, we did. How about you guys?
So I read about, so we've been working with the Produce Market Association, and they got the new sustainability efforts, like the new strategy. And local procurement is very important because they know if there's a disruption. Restaurants, also the National Restaurant Association, they're looking into procuring locally more, which I think it's an opportunity for our farmers. But then it's sad that these had to happen for that to be occurring. And I think an important thing that happened too is how restaurants shifted and pivoted, like Tim was saying, to meal delivery. I mean, it was fascinating to see all the restaurants doing this meal delivery and buying from local farmers. I think it tells a lot about how the local food systems kind of got more important or more relevant for everyone.
Well, and cities and communities got together and closed off streets so that they could have restaurant space, outside and to try to keep that restaurant industry and the local tourism going. I mean, I think that was also a really great coordinated effort between city officials, the police, the businesses in that area. I mean, yeah. So that's another impact that we saw, even in all over the country. I mean, I saw some pictures of New York where they had major streets shut down because they had their restaurants out there. So,
A different supermarket angle that I think is interesting is that the emergency food system is very connected to the supermarkets, and the kind of changes to supermarket sales and the supply chain issues which are causing supermarkets to have less inventory actually also disrupt the supply of items donated by the supermarkets to the emergency food system, to the food banks. And so this is an interesting thing that is part of our work thinking about emergency management. It's like when we have an ongoing crisis like this, and this is something about the emergency food system in general, like how much should we think about people relying on this? We don't want to create a system where we want to create a system where people can use this emergency food system when they need it, but ultimately then they can get to a place where they're not having to rely on it, right? And so there was this interesting thing to think about: what is the role of things that are meant as these kind of immediate kind of crisis support systems, and that whole apparatus was disrupted in its relationship to supermarkets. And so I don't know that we've actually, because there continue to be inventory shortages at supermarkets, that hasn't resolved. And that's something that I think a lot of food banks are working to try to address and think about even right now, is what that's going to look like for them moving forward.
that's actually an excellent point because, the food banks, normally they would only take canned goods, right? And those types of things. So we had the food banks in Utah, they actually contracted with kitchens and chefs and invited anyone, and especially the local farmers, to provide, like any type of, even like vegetables, meats, you name it. And then they made takeout meals and distributed those to people in the community who actually who needed a meal. And so that was a major change.
Yeah.
And I think a good one.
Yeah, I think that happened in California.
You know,
too.
because it's kind of
Yeah.
like a food bank, but you can only give them canned goods. I mean, that whole model in the past was just kind of odd anyway. And the farmers always wanted to donate to the food bank. Food bank was like, yeah, sorry, we can't do anything with it. So I think hopefully that was another good outcome. But yeah, you're just right. That food bank situation got kind of crazy for a while. Yeah.
Well, I don't think, Tim, do you want to talk about what feedback we got on the farm to family food box program, or do you want me to try to cover that, or?
Yeah, I mean, go ahead. You can talk about the food box program. Definitely some controversy around it and some questions about its impact for local producers, but certainly it was something, it was a lever AMS pulled quickly. But
Well,
maybe talk a little bit about that.
What was very unevenly received, because people with well-developed food hubs were well positioned. Lots of places saw it not get to farms basically at all, lots of controversy, but if you haven't watched it, I think partly at least from feedback that came from this community practice. If you're not paying attention, what has happened now, which will be at least the intermediate term solution, is there's this new LFPA program, which is gonna be a state block grant. So I think what they figured out is place-based stuff matters, which is where extension comes in again. So every state's gonna get block grant, and they can actually give out those grants state-based the way they want to. So I got to serve on the selection committee for Colorado, and so what our state chose to use, and it's Health and Human Services, Department of Ag, and Economic Development and International Trade, is they're doing a grant program, but they're using it to feed the food banks, having a relationship with local procurement partners, because there was some evidence that in places where those were already well developed, that solves some of the both food insecurity and supply chain. So in our state, the grants are going to go specifically to anyone who can prove they already have a standing procurement relationship with someone that this could use this block grant will be used to augment. So someone can't be opportunistic and stupid and all of a sudden say, we want to do this, and then the food banks either have to be indirectly or directly involved. It can go through the food bank or the food bank through a series like Feeding Colorado, it's part of America. So that's an interesting thing. Based, I think, someone on feedback from this new practice of like how the USDA didn't totally abandon farmer family food box, which is where this comes in. And so a supermarket could even be in the middle of that if they were in part of the donation process. They're trying to build that so next time it happens, there's already kind of these standing relationships where they all know how to do business together. And if they have to ramp it up, it can be ramped up in a week instead of being figured out over 6 weeks. So that's a place where I see these policy levers being built, and it'll be interesting to see, because we were a first state, so we're actually like, it'd be interesting to kind of track how different states use that block grant and how they decide to make it work for their state and their players. So have any of you heard of what your states are doing yet, by chance? What? You should make sure it's your mouth.
We copied you.
Okay.
Utah copied Colorado. It's
You're
just
doing the
like-
same thing.
and it's the grant money's already been allocated and everything. So all the
Well, we
processes
of course
are.
haven't gotten ourselves.
Ruby was on the review board. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I've heard griping about it. I don't actually know what's happening yet, but there's a lot of power structures at play of various folks who want to have their hand in it at the state level. So, I'm not sure where that's all shaken out at this point. But yeah, I don't think that there's like tons of, I think there's concern, about where certain things might end up, and, so we'll see how it plays out.
Our process seems pretty transparent on this stuff.
That's
We
great,
have those
that's
standard
great.
procurement processes that if you want to keep where you can't have a say in how it's held, but it's like, people get conflict of interest. So
Yeah,
it's really
yeah.
unfortunate. Anyways, that's something to keep track of too.
Yeah, totally.
Did this kind of hit the mark what people wanted to talk about? Or did you want more answers? Actually.
Okay, can I ask,
Case study.
can I ask Ariana a question?
Yeah.
Like, how did this, you're like, you got an email, like how, I mean, there were so many things,
Maria would relate.
there are so many things that, I mean,
Love Bill Gates, just say love Bill Gates on the bottom.
I don't,
I got, an administration.
okay,
Oh,
okay.
Got an email.
But who started this? Thank you for coming.
I think there was an ongoing relationship with
Okay.
Microsoft.
Okay.
And then COVID happened. And
And
it's
they
like,
just
okay, well,
decided-
let's pivot and let's do something. And then they were sending an email, who wants to get involved? And I'm like, I would like to.
Okay.
And kind of volunteered, but also not. And then we went there and
We
yeah.
all had one of those experiences. during
Yeah, and then people, then few people,
COVID.
we were more and then we became less and then we pushed for a year and a half. It wasn't easy.
But was
It was
the-
innocent.
Was like what it was already determined, like the administration said, like you have to do a food market or this?
No,
is
no,
something-
no, no.
Oh, okay, I thought you were
No,
like.
no, like
"Oh."
how do we leverage on these resources?
Okay, gotcha.
And then it's like, okay, farmers are asking to,
Okay.
how can I sell online? I don't want to sell through Facebook. So we're like, okay, let's build
Okay.
an online farmers market or an online market.
Market maker at that time, I remember there were already some websites trying to sell for market maker never took off.
Yeah, I don't think they're selling.
Selling, it was just to announce. But I remember there was farm to fork at that time, when they were trying to sell already. So what happened? I mean, so why do you have to start from scratch? Rather than, and I don't know whether I.
There's many platforms. So that's a
Yeah.
good question.
So how many, why didn't you use one of the platforms that were already available and adapted rather than create everything from scratch?
Yeah, so, well, market maker doesn't sell. So we looked into them. The others were for profit, so they would charge farmers. And they would not be able to charge farmers. So we wanted to make it free. And then, so that's why we,
I remember asking them how much it was just in farmers. And it is not that much.
but we couldn't get money
About
from farmers.
$50 per year. Which I think that was bad
No, it wasn't.
at that time for a farmer. So I'm not questioning, I'm
Yeah.
just
No, no,
thinking.
it's typically US, this is a response, it's like, because there are platforms. The
Yeah.
National Young Farmers Coalition put together a beautiful webinar,
Mhm.
a publication on the trade-offs of them. They are not overly costly. Anyone who's a confident business person I work with is using them and feels like they're very purchased, right? Because it should be free. If it's free, there is some string attached. I'm not
Mhm.
debating you shouldn't have done that, but it's like, this is our very typical response. It's like, even before knowing if anyone will use it, because like Kim has said, so we've been working with some people forever. And there has to be a tipping point, and so, and those people probably already found a platform or on one. So this is really trying to like make the people who $5 seems like too much, they won't pay,
Mhm.
and are they really serious about being online then, and that's.
Yeah.
Where our response is sometimes with amateurish is like, we rush in with the solution before they actually tell us they'll
Yeah.
use it, whereas. That's what we're trying to use community practice and saying, if you guys are already doing it, already viable, already cash flowing, have been around 5 or 10 years. If you say it'll solve your problem, you in some way have more gravitas because you already walked in the walk.
Yeah.
And because some of those squeakiest wheels will tell you, well, just do this and we'll all be better. Well, will we? And it's a really hard thing as an extension person to know how to distribute our technical systems, because there's some people who will take it without really a good faith ever.
Yeah.
They're actually gonna do anything with it. Whereas, other people are just sitting there very well positioned, and it's hard to
Yeah.
discriminate a little bit. And I'm sure you guys cover with them about as we, and,
Yeah. So a lot of the training was, what are the options for farmers? Like I would put all the options and say, this is one of them. It's not the only, but this is an option if you don't want to spend money. Because a lot of people don't want to spend money. Because they're probably not serious about it. They think COVID is going to be 3 to 4 months, so I don't want to invest on it. Jim wants to say, oh.
do you wanna talk to him, or you just type him forward?
Oh, I didn't want to interrupt there, but just kind of following up Ariana's comment about the online platform support. We did a lot of that through Extension in Kentucky. What we're seeing, like in things like working with the Farmers Market Coalition and the National CSA Innovation Network, there are some awesome new resources, tools, platforms that are being developed by institutions. Yes, some of them are fee-based, but they're also very targeted to these folks that are becoming more sophisticated in their engagement with direct to consumers. And that business model, as it becomes more sophisticated, it's attracting interesting technical assistance providers outside of extension. And so maybe just pinging into this extension question a little bit, just wondering, will our role be morphing a little bit?
I think so. Well, and I just realized we were 5 minutes over and there's actually a 6:30 event, because we got talking. I don't think this group's going anywhere, but I would actually say, guys, now that I've seen your papers, have you guys thought of making this either like choices or an FDRS special issue? Because these, although these don't only get characters of research, these are examples that every state's gonna have a faith-based solution, but the more things we saw other places did would not hurt. Think about it, just because I know papers were not required for these track sessions, but I think they'd be used. Otherwise, but at least your QR, if you could send your QR code, or you have a place in the app, you can actually add a comment to the live discussion, add that so anybody wants to.
Oh, yeah, okay, cool.
But otherwise, thank you for coming. You know, I'm finding these ladies, I hope. Thank you for a great panel. Tim, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, intrepid,
Yeah,
you know,
stay
audience.
strong, Tim. I know it's been not an easy week.
So Tim, according to the AEA, you and I are both moving to West Virginia University. So I'm looking forward to working with you, Tim.
Oh, awesome.
Both are.
Bye, Tim.
Bye all.
Bye.